Tema Talks is brought to you by the Tema Conter Memorial Trust, which is Canada's leading provider of peer support, family assistance, education and training for emergency services, public safety, military personnel, and their families. Check out tema.ca for more information. The views, opinions, and endorsements expressed in each podcast episode are those of the host and the guest alone, and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Tema Conter Memorial Trust. The subject matter of this podcast may be triggering for some listeners. Please take the time to get yourself in a calm and positive mind space before listening so you can get the most out of the podcast. Okay, cue the music and enjoy this episode of Tema Talks.
Hello people, and welcome to Tema Talks. Also welcome to PTSD Awareness Month. That's right, June is PTSD Awareness Month, and Tema Talks is doing its part by trying to put out lots of episodes in June. My goal is to put out an episode every Monday and Thursday in June, and I only have one more interview that I need to record in order to make that happen, so I'll get it done, don't worry. Got to do my part, and I know you're doing yours. So thank you for that, and thank you for everybody who continues to support this podcast, obviously. Before I introduce the guest, I want to talk about the subject matter of this episode because it means a lot to me personally. We're going to be talking about caregiver trauma or secondary trauma. And I want to hit you with a stat. You're going to hear it later on as well, but I'm going to hit you with it now. Unpaid caregivers account for 75% of care provided to people at home. What does that mean? That means that 8 million people in Canada are unpaid caregivers. Family members, essentially, caring for their loved ones. That's pretty significant. Especially with what we're learning now on how much of a toll it takes on caregivers to give care. As I said, this really hit me hard because in my family, I was not the one that was supposed to get sick. My wife Amanda has MS, and I knew that from the first day that I met her. And it didn't faze me. At the time I was working as a paramedic and a communications officer, and that didn't set me back at all, as I like to care for people, and, am a quote, I like to quote unquote fix people, or think that I can. So we went on with our relationship knowing that, and keeping in mind that Amanda at some point may need some more help, her MS may deteriorate, may progress, and we always sort of kept that in mind. Amanda has had lots of ups and downs with her MS. For the most part, has gotten through everything really well. She takes awesome care of herself. One of the most organized and disciplined people, actually the most organized and disciplined person I've ever met, especially when it comes to her health. But I'm supposed to be the rock. I'm supposed to be the one that will take care of things when she can't. And that didn't happen, for the most part. It didn't happen early on because I was probably sick and didn't know it. So wasn't as supportive in her downtimes as I could have been. Made some horrible mistakes with support for her. And then I fell apart, which created a lot of issues for me and my family. My wife and daughter at home saw sides of me that that I didn't even know existed. They saw a lot of anger. They saw a lot of outbursts. They heard a lot of words that should never have been said, and that I didn't mean, but that you can't take back. You can't unhear them. A lot of actions that you can't undo, or you can't erase from somebody's memory. It was horrible. They also saw somebody who went from being very confident to having zero confidence, even completing simple tasks around the house. Had zero confidence and needed to, a lot of guidance to get through things, which was energy that my wife didn't plan on spending on me, as she needs a lot of energy to get through her day normally. So, caused a lot of guilt. I still carry that guilt with me every day. A lot of embarrassment, a lot of shame, personally for me. Like, how could I do this? How could I deteriorate this much? And I still think about that today. And I worry about how much damage it did to them, having to go through that with me. We're really open as far as communication goes in our family, and we talk about things a lot, which is really important. And, especially for my daughter, who's 15 now, and who wants to be a Halifax police officer. That's all she wants to be. And she's actually a member of the Halifax Police Youth Program right now. So saying that makes me, in saying that, I am really proud of her. Extremely proud of her. She's awesome. Those of you that have met her know what I'm talking about. But it also terrifies me because I know what she's getting into, for the most part, as far as the emotional toll. So I try to give her all the skills that I can. I try to build my mental health community so that if she ever needs anything and I can't give her what she needs, I know the people that can. So like I said, this subject meant a lot to me. And my guest of this episode is Tara Collins. She's recently been in the news a little bit, speaking of, talking about her story. She is the wife of a Canadian Air Force veteran who was diagnosed with PTSD and then subsequently got diagnosed herself with PTSD as a result of being a caregiver for her husband. Tara tells us her story and how being a caregiver affected her life. So, enough from me. Let's get to it.
It was a dark and stormy night, nor'easter rolling in.
Welcome to Tema Talks, Tara. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. We're going to talk about something very important today, and that being caregiver trauma or secondary trauma, which is a really important subject to talk about. It's we don't often think of that. We don't often think of the caregivers, the millions of people who are unpaid taking care of loved ones who are struggling. We don't usually think of them and what they may go through. So it's a huge pleasure, and I'm really excited to talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. So first, Tara, just for us to get to know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where you grew up and how you grew up, your upbringing.
Yep. So I'm 39 years old. I have a partner who I've been together with for 16 years. We have 2 children. One of them is actually my stepdaughter, 17 and 11. In terms of my background, in terms of where I grew up, I primarily Alberta, so Calgary and Lethbridge, Alberta, and grew up with 2 parents who were social workers, and they were both professors in social work. So, so kind of a different background there. And I have 2 brothers. One of them's a teacher and the other one's an electrician, who are both in Calgary. My parents are both in Lethbridge at this point in time, and I'm also in Lethbridge as well with my family at this point.
Great. Awesome. Thank you for that. You mentioned, Tara, that you have been with your husband with your partner for 16 years, and he's in the military, or was in the military.
He was. He served for about 15 years in the military. And so we got together in 2003, and by that time he'd already served, I want to say almost, 20 some odd years, or no, sorry, not 20 some odd years. He's already served about 10 years anyways.
Right.
Yeah. And so, we met in Edmonton, and yeah, we, were together for, probably about a year before we moved in together. And at the time, even though my background, which will also, I'm also a social worker.
Right.
So at the time, however, I didn't really notice any bizarre behaviors. And, so he was in the military until 2008, at which time he was actually discharged on a back injury and eventually, diagnosed with PTSD. That being said, I'd probably say that he's had some of the symptoms associated prior to it, but at the time I didn't realize it and just thought some of his behaviors were a bit different and a little bit bizarre. But
yeah, so you were like he had tours in Afghanistan, Bosnia, and Croatia, and you know, in your early years together, I mean, like, how did you find that? Because it is, I believe, it's a unique situation being the spouse of somebody in the military, an active duty.
And actually at the time, so he'd actually had already done all of his tours. However, he had gone away, just for training, for example, to Wainwright. However, he did already all of his, tours at the time. So I'm in kind of a unique position where he probably at the time had PTSD. However, it didn't, a post-traumatic stress disorder. However, it really didn't come out, I guess, to an extreme level, I'd say, until about 2011. There was, as I said, some symptoms beforehand. However, I didn't, even with my social work background, it was really confusing for me. I grew up in a very, very different environment. So my family was always quite nurturing. Not very, I guess you could say not very angry.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of a different, kind of way to live, confusing, as I said. So.
Yeah. So he left the military, was medically released in 2008 because of a back injury. And then 2 years after that, he was diagnosed with PTSD. So what was it like those 2 years where he was out of the military? I mean, did things start to bubble up then? Like, or how'd you find that?
Yeah, and prior to it, there were kind of snippets of behaviors that I thought were kind of unusual. However, and ironically though, it wasn't me that had pointed out that he had, some really bizarre behaviors. It was Veterans Affairs. He had sat down with them with regards to his back injury, and somebody said, I think that something else is going on here for you. Because at the time he was spending a fair bit of time isolating and drinking. So when we were in Edmonton, he spent a lot of time in the garage. And so I think that's part of the reason I didn't notice as much, is because he was kind of in the garage, kind of isolating with some of his, friends actually from the military. And at the time I was just doing my own thing in the house. And, so we spent a fair bit of time apart in the sense that, even though we were in the same home, kind of separate lives in a sense. Right. So I think that was part of the reason anyways, it didn't really, stand out for me as much.
Right. Okay. And then, so he gets diagnosed in 2010, and you said around 2011 things took another sort of shift.
Well, what had happened actually is he had gone out to Saskatchewan. His father was becoming quite ill.
Okay.
And so my daughter and I were in Lethbridge at the time and slowly kind of making our way to transition to Saskatchewan. And so we ended up moving out there after I'd finished work in 2011. And that's when things were just really at its worst. He was going out a fair bit and getting intoxicated and would black out and wouldn't even know when he did certain things, would lash out. He would drink to the point of intoxication, and he's hit a fence, for example. Like, he was definitely a lot of road rage as well. This and really short, short fuse for sure. He would have nightmares, and it's not that he didn't have some of this stuff before, but as I said, it wasn't as severe, and it wasn't. It almost became who he was somebody that was angry all the time and drank all the time, or was hyper vigilant or always on guard. If something startled him, then he'd really struggle with that piece and either lash out or lashing out was his main thing, I'd say. He displayed more external behaviors than myself, and I struggle, so.
Yeah. Now, so what was that like for you? How did that make you feel? How were you doing at that point?
Yeah. Well, that was a really difficult period for me. I became quite depressed at the time. Our daughter was, our daughter's 11 now, but she was quite a bit younger, obviously, in 2011 there. And so I was home with our daughter and my stepdaughter, and he was virtually out all the time. Like, I didn't see him very often, and there were times he would come home and he would be just absolutely, extremely intoxicated and just foul, right?
Right.
To the point there was a time, for example, he came home and his whole face was smashed up from getting into fights, and that was quite common as well for him to get into different altercations, and that's certainly, so my anxiety definitely went up a fair bit. I was always worried that something was going to happen to him, or he was going to get arrested or something. Like, right. I just didn't know, I guess some days I didn't know if he was going to be alive or dead sometimes, because there were times that he would, it'd be 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock at night or in the morning, and I'd send him a message and say, are you coming home? Because I was also struggling with, slowly becoming more and more anxious and more of my own difficulties. And he'd say, yeah, I'll be home in half an hour. And 2-3 hours later, he was still out. And then I'd message him again and, oh yeah, I'll be home in half an hour. And there were times where he wouldn't come home until 6-7 in the morning, or there were times that on one occasion, he passed out in the vehicle with his foot on the brake.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, and I wouldn't even say actually that, I think he was using alcohol more as a way to cope with PTSD than, a lot of military members that have post-traumatic stress have those concurrent disorders. So they both struggle with an alcohol addiction and PTSD. But I think for him, it was more, coping. So alcohol was a problem for him, but it was more a way to mask all the other symptoms. So,
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was very difficult for myself. I had to be the primary caregiver for our children. He wouldn't necessarily engage with our children a lot, so he wasn't doing a lot with them either.
Right.
And so that was difficult as well, because I knew at the time that he was a good person, but he was struggling, and I knew that he had the ability because I'd seen him, snippets of him being an excellent father and very, very engaging with the kids, but definitely during those really, really hard times, he struggled, quite a bit to be able to actively engage with myself and actively be there for the kids. And so really he was out all the time at the bar and out with friends and just.
Yeah. Just sort of floating along.
Mm-hmm.
But.
And then when he was.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, when he was home, there were certainly a lot of occasions where we were walking on eggshells. I'm not sure, whether he was going to explode or, he used to actually punch things. He never was physical with myself or the kids, but he would punch, for example, the wall or punch vehicles, like when he was really angry. And what would happen is his anger would actually dissipate, and he'd be almost completely fine after he got this outburst of anger out, and to kind of expect the girls and I to be fine. Meanwhile, instead it kind of bottled up in myself in particular, and a little bit the kids too, that, still had that ongoing kind of, I wouldn't say I'm not really an angry person per se, but I think a lot of confusion and a lot of, fear almost. I was afraid in a lot of respects, and so he expected me to be, fine right after he let his emotions out. Meanwhile, I had to sit with that, and I obviously led to a fair bit of issues myself as well, because I didn't have that same kind of outlet, and I'm not an aggressive person by all means, so I didn't have that ability to just punch something and get it out.
I mean, so you had, at that time, you would have had one daughter that was quite young, like 3 or 4. And you would have had another daughter that was probably around 10 or so going through this. I mean, and that, she's obviously more aware and, cognizant of what's going on. How did you deal with that? Or how was that?
Well, I think part of it is trying to do the best I can as a parent myself, but also, as my own mental health struggled, that's obviously a struggle as well. My 17-year-old comes from kind of a tumultuous family upbringing with her biological mom. So at the same time, although there were certainly times where she would be afraid when her dad would lose his temper, at the same time she viewed him in kind of a utopian light for getting her out of a different situation. So so in a sense she went from a very toxic situation to having, as I said, he could be an excellent father, but at the same time struggle as well. So kind of an inconsistent parent, and eventually myself also probably struggling with becoming inconsistent over time in terms of being able to engage with my own issues that came. However, obviously both of us, him with his issues and me with my issues, tried our best as parents with what we had. So.
Yeah, and then so obviously you deal with this. You're the primary caregiver, like you said, for a number of years, and then in 2015 you get diagnosed with PTSD.
Yeah, and I, to be honest, I probably should have been diagnosed prior to that.
Right.
However, what had happened during that time is I actually went back to school for my PhD.
Before or after you were diagnosed?
Before.
Okay.
So actually in 2015, I went back. So actually, I'm going to back up a little bit, because what happened is in Saskatchewan, we finally, because we ended up moving to a little town. First a farm and then a little town, and the bar was right by by our house, so you could just walk. And so, if you can imagine, a lot of times were spent in that bar for him, and kind of doing his own thing. And so eventually I said, you know what, I can't do this anymore, and I have to, my mental health is getting worse and worse. And so I ended up, as soon as he said it's okay to bring our daughter outside of the province, I actually ended up moving back to Alberta with her, and then waiting for them to eventually transition. But no, so my daughter and I are, the 11-year-old now, moved back to Alberta. And during that time, there was something definitely wrong with me in terms of my own mental health. I was crying a lot. I had a hard time, with even functioning day to day. I didn't even work at the time, and I couldn't have work, to be very honest with you. I just was not functioning how I should have as, even as a parent at the time. I was very fortunate that my daughter and I actually stayed with my parents at the time. And as I said, they're both social workers. They're, amazing people, very supportive, and really, basically had to essentially really help out with that parenting at the time while I, dealt with my own mental health issues. During this time, so, Charles continued to go out and drink and, get intoxicated. And, lash out. He got into some altercations, some physical altercations with his couple of his siblings. He ended up throwing his nephew over a car and getting into an altercation with him. And this was when I was back in Lethbridge. And finally, kind of, he got to a point where, and I believe it was the same day actually that he got into an altercation with his nephew. He just kind of lost it to the point that he was going to, he just was driving, and his goal was to get back to Afghanistan just to hopefully get blown up. At the time, that was his goal. And so eventually, myself and some of his friends were able to talk him down. And, so he's very fortunate in the sense that he was able to, call his psychologist at the time and get into a treatment center in Ontario, for concurrent disorders. So Bellwood Treatment Center for 8.5 weeks.
Okay. And,
so he went for, alcohol and post-traumatic stress. And so he was very lucky that way, but in the same sense, I was definitely struggling. And so I still remember to this day calling him up on a number of occasions while he was there. And of course, can't really get through to somebody when they're in treatment, but I remember they must have thought that there was something severely wrong with me, which there was. Like, I struggled with my own mental health, but I used to call and just leave these big long messages about how I needed him to call me and how I needed him to call me right now because I was my own struggles and I was struggling trying to parent, being a single parent. And, so it was very, very challenging for me. And there's times even now that I'll say to him, it's not really fair that you were able to get all of this help for 8.5 weeks. And meanwhile, I was broken as well. And I didn't have that opportunity. I tried to go on a weekend retreat to kind of help with my own mental health issues. And so I actually sent all the information into Veterans Affairs and they denied me even for the weekend type thing. Really? So that came out of my own pocket with that piece. And as I said, I didn't work from February all the way till September, just because of my own struggles. And, eventually I got into, the PhD program. And I'm actually very, very fortunate that my mental health slowly started getting better in, I ended up going to, a lot of counseling. Also, I did actually everything you can possibly think of in terms of trying to get better. I went to acupuncture. I went to, a wellness coach. I went to counseling and all of this, of course, most of it ended up coming out of my own budget, whatever that was, which was very, very little at the time, but I did what I could to try to better myself so that I could function for my family and especially for the kids, right? When I was broken myself, the one thing that was covered was the, counseling, in terms of individual sessions. So Veterans Affairs, for example, will pay for it if it's related to the post-traumatic stress or, so for a certain number of sessions. The unfortunate piece with that is a lot of times, the practitioners aren't specialized, one, in military culture, but two, in the understanding of secondary trauma or, the fact that the PTSD in a military member can essentially trickle down to the family. And so, and those both in combination are so important because obviously the military culture is just very, very different. It's, the concept of looking at an individual in society. Normally we have this notion of, almost survival of the fittest in terms of looking at the individual and everybody focusing on their individual needs. Whereas in the military, it's a collective need. And a lot of times, that collective need first and foremost is the military and secondary to the military is your family. Because the military essentially is your family. It's, people you have to live and sometimes die for in certain circumstances, which is very different than your civilian society because generally that's not.
Yeah.
So.
So you're in your third year now in your PhD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how is that going for you? How are you doing now?
So I would definitely say there's, over the last 3 years, I've had my struggles for sure. And there have been times, like sometimes days where I wouldn't be able to function. So, just to provide another context, my, Charles eventually came back to Lethbridge, and at that time as I said, I got into my PhD, but my PhD was in Calgary. So we actually had to do a complete flip in terms of who took on the parenting role. So when he came back from treatment, I mean, certainly there's still days that he struggles, but he was doing a lot better. Meanwhile, I was the one who was broken. So we kind of shifted from him being broken to both of us being broken to him doing a lot better and to me being broken. And in a sense, it's kind of lucky that he did have that ability to feel better in a lot of respects, because I ended up moving to Calgary primarily because my PhD was in Calgary. And so he had to take on that primary parent role. And really, I woke up one day and went to Calgary, and I had to tell him, you know what, you have to plan everything for the kids. Now, I can't do this. I can't. And beforehand, I had to do all of his paperwork. I had to do all of the kids' stuff. I had to arrange all of everything for the kids and everything for him. And when I went for my PhD, I said, I can't do any of this anymore. I have to focus on myself, and I have to focus on my PhD to better our family in the long run.
Right.
And so he had to pick that up. And, you know, to be honest, I was surprised, but he's been able to do that a lot better than I thought. He definitely has days where he struggles. And actually, and I can tell sometimes when there's days that he worries that he's going to revert back to, how he was.
Right.
But certainly now it's interesting too, because, he moved to Lethbridge and didn't know a lot of people, which in a sense was good.
Right.
Because, he's certainly flipped in terms of being, his focus before was drinking, going out with friends, but now he has to be more family focused, and he has to be very child focused. So he does a lot with the kids now. And as I said, I'm not saying that there aren't bad days, because there certainly are. And he does still struggle with his temper. Actually, even a few days ago, my daughter looked at him and said, "Dad, you have anger and management issues." And he certainly does at times, but he now, he's been very good as well. As when he meets with counselors, he often will try to take in the suggestions that they've provided. So,
okay.
And he also receives support through the Occupational Stress Injury Clinic peer support. And that's what he's found the most useful, actually, is getting to have those peer interactions. And not necessarily, sometimes they don't even talk about the military. Sometimes it's just it could be their struggles at home. It could just be, you know, being able to interact with somebody who understands the military culture, understands the, that they've been through trauma, not necessarily disclosing what that trauma is, but just being able to relate to people in those circumstances, I think has been really beneficial for him. Mm-hmm. And at times more so than counseling, other than the long-term residential counseling, but that's been probably the most helpful piece for him. How
are you doing now, would you say?
To be honest, I'm doing a lot better than I used to. As I mentioned, when I first came back from Saskatchewan, I'd send my daughter off to school, and I could barely get out of bed. And when he finally did move back to Lethbridge because we had the 17-year-old stayed at school there, and so we didn't want to pull her out too early, whereas our daughter was a fair bit younger. So during that time, I when I did see him, there's a lot of things that would trigger me, especially him raising his voice. And I'm, as I mentioned earlier, he's externalizes. So he kind of, when he's frustrated with something, he will yell and lose his temper. Whereas me, I completely shut down and almost curl into a little ball. And still to this day, though, I find that if he raises his voice or, there's certain things that he does anyways that triggers me to the point that I completely shut down and I won't even almost hear what he has to say. And I think part of it is my own self-defense mechanism and my own way to protect myself sometimes because as I mentioned, I didn't grow up like that. My family, my parents fight, but they're not verbally aggressive. And Charles certainly can be verbally aggressive in that I just go into almost a panic mode. And so I still do struggle in that respect. The one way that I was fortunate is eventually, and Lethbridge actually has a very good service that Calgary doesn't, despite the fact that Calgary is a lot bigger. Lethbridge has free group counseling through Alberta Health Services. Okay. And so I ended up doing a lot of groups. Again, it wasn't focused towards military or trauma per se. It was that kind of general mental health, but even being in those group environments and be able to talk about my own issues certainly helped. And so it was quite intensive in the sense that it was 2 times a week for how long? I'm trying to think, 40 weeks or something. Like it was quite yeah. And as I said, a lot of these big centers don't have those kind of supports, which is unfortunate. And so, except for that unless you pay for them. And, as I mentioned, I don't know whether or not the military would have paid had it not been reimbursed.
Right. Absolutely. So, Tara, I became aware of you and your story through another guest, Richard LeBlanc, sent me the article that recently came out, and it outlined your story and also talked about a web series called Being There, which I believe that you're a part of. Is that right?
Yeah. So another PhD student actually approached me about this web series that he was completing on caregivers in general. So there was an array of different subjects, and he thought it was kind of interesting knowing that my situation of residing with a military member with PTSD, which I think is quite different from some of the stories that he has. And he thought, well, that would be actually also a good fit. And so he interviewed myself as well as I had basically different clips of my family as well interacting. Okay. And so it was quite an interesting experience to be able to talk about my story or our story as a family and, being able to articulate some of those concerns. And
well, one of the things when I was reading the article, and I think this is part of the web series, but what jumped out at me, because I had never really thought about this before, is that unpaid caregivers account for 75% of all care provided to people at home. In Canada. And in Canada, that amounts to about 8 million caregivers in Canada, and from what the web series was saying, that's expected to double in 30 years.
Yeah, that's scary, eh?
That's staggering when you think about it.
Not only that, for the military, just to provide kind of context, they say that interpersonal relationships problems are one of the most, the fastest growing issue as well. So
for sure.
There's probably, tons of issues that are going to transpire with military members and families. And so.
I mean, I definitely, military, I sort of set aside as its own special entity because it is so different. But when you broaden it out to the whole first responder world, I mean, one of the key things in an interpersonal relationship is communication. And one of the things that that first responders and military don't do well across the board is communicate on a personal level. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, it completely does. And another piece with that is I think, Charles has the is stuck with 3 females in the house too. And
Yeah.
if you think about that with military, they train you essentially, you have to have, 2 different feelings or different ways of looking at things, either aggression or anger. Otherwise, you're going to probably die if you don't have those able to mask all the other emotions. And so he comes home and sees these girls crying, right? And his first reaction, and even to this day, he'll say, stop crying. You need to stop crying. You just need, because I think for him, and part of it is the military culture in general, but trains them that that's not okay to have those feelings. And so when he comes home, so it's really hard for him to this day.
He probably starts to panic a little bit because he had no idea how to deal with that. I mean, I know I have those feelings. I'm not in the military. I can only imagine for him, I'm not trained to deal with this. I have no idea how to deal with this at all.
Well, I think, for him too, like I didn't see him cry for, I want to say 12, 13 years. And the first time I did was actually after, he went to Bellwood. And I think what they try to do is instill, it's okay to have those different feelings. And to this day, I think I've probably seen him cry maybe 2, 3 times, except for in sad movies. That's another situation altogether. But, no, but generally, like if it has to do with a sad event, like, for example, his father passed away. I did not see him cry. I still haven't seen him cry. And that was 7 years ago, that's just, it wasn't instilled in him to cry. And so, it's kind of a different, and especially with my own family, as I said, I grew up with social workers. My dad's a very sensitive man. My brothers are very sensitive. So for me, that, crying to me is just normal.
Part of life. Yeah, as it should be.
Yeah.
So where can people see this web series if they wanted to? Do you know?
Oh, that's a good question. That's
okay. I jumped on you there with that.
Yeah, no, it's Story for Caregivers. If they Google
Story
that.
for Caregivers, okay.
Yeah. Then it's on that website there. And, as I said, there's a few different, pieces. I can't remember all of them, but there's a number of different, and ours is quite different to the other ones.
Were you, did you find that it came out? Were you happy with how it came out, how the story came out? It was all done, yeah?
Oh, for sure. I think they did an excellent job filming it. I actually didn't know that it was going to do as well as it did. And a friend of mine from Saskatchewan said, I just saw you on a TELUS commercial. And I thought, oh, my goodness, I was biting my nails in it. I didn't even I don't know. But I mean, the point of it was to obviously get the importance of, that there is a struggle with family. And as you mentioned earlier, families aren't even often regarded as having that impact on them. And even though, even if you look, for example, at the Child and Family Services Act, it talks about families as being the basic unit of society, but we don't really take into account that importance that families play, despite the fact that it's, we talk about it, families as being important, but we don't always regard their needs for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and that has to change. Tara, if someone wants to get a hold of you or wants to reach out to you for whatever reason, are there ways they can do that on social media, or how can they contact you?
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely open to talking to anybody about my own struggle, and I've actually had a number of people track me down through the university and email me. I'm even open on my phone, whichever, but my email is Tara, Tara, .BOLLINS 2 at ucalgary.ca. So again, Tara.Collins2 at ucalgary.ca. And as I said, I'm more than willing to talk to anybody because I do think it's a very important issue it's very confusing as well. I think for not only military members, but families, to understand what's going on for them. And so my PhD is actually focused on military families and how they cope with residing with a military member. So my topic's very specific to this as well, just because I really think there's a need for services, especially actually there's a lot of services lacking for children.
Yeah. Speaking of that, sorry, before we start to wrap this up, I want to ask, how are your girls doing?
They're doing pretty well. Both of the girls actually also go to counseling to this day, and
Okay.
yeah, I think they still probably will. However, like an example of where I think there's a lack of services is Charles and I have gone to a few different things. One, there's a program called COPE, Couples Overcoming Post-Traumatic
Right.
Stress every day. And there's
Right.
also a program called CAN Praxis, which is an equine kind of
Yeah.
program to help with communication. And I remember my daughter saying, well, Mom, why can't I go to this program? It's, this impacts me too. And
Right.
unfortunately, these services don't have the funding at this point in time to meet the whole family's needs. I think there's an expectation that it will trickle down to children, but yet children are also a very important part of, helping not only themselves, like family as a whole, recover, but also the military member too. So I think that the whole unit and being able to, those relationships are crucial, and looking at, children's needs are also very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that everybody seems to be on the right track at this point in time, which is great. Thanks for letting us know that. Tara, I'm going to change up my last question that I normally ask every guest. I'm going to change it up for you. What I'd like to ask you is that if there is someone listening that is struggling because they are taking care of or live with somebody who is struggling, what would you say to them?
Well, I think just trying to access as many supports as you can, and really advocating for yourself and your partner or your family member, because oftentimes it's really difficult to access the supports and you have to jump through those hoops. But I'd say, keep plugging through those supports as best as you can, and or those hoops, to get those supports, because honestly, I don't know that I would be here or Charles would be here at this point if we didn't try to access what supports there are. As I said, I don't think there's, in a lot of respects, adequate supports, but the supports that there are, I'd say definitely access, because, you'll need them for yourself and your family. So.
Yeah. Well said. Tara, I want to thank you for taking the time and shedding some light on this crucial subject that certainly doesn't get enough attention, and hopefully we can change that. It's a really important piece of this puzzle that we're trying to figure out. Just what kind of toll this takes on caregivers and immediate family. The collateral damage of all this. I want to thank you. Please keep doing your work and keep speaking out if you can. And I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Sean. Hopefully this will help other people to be able to realize that their needs as family members are also very important. And
Oh, absolutely it will. There's no doubt. There's no doubt that it will. Tara, please take care of yourself. Continue to take care of your family. Congratulations on keeping the family together. That in itself is a feat. That you're still a unit.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, but we'll keep plugging away.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks again, Tara. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Now my shift is finally over. I gotta deal with what's mine.
That was awesome. Thank you, Tara, for telling us your story, for taking the time to be with us. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did, and thank you for tuning in and listening. Before we sign off, I want to tell you about another event. So if you are going to be in the Halifax area at the end of September 29th, and you like golf, you need to check out the Facebook page, Help Our Heroes Golf Tournament, put on by firefighter Bobby McKenzie. He is a past Tema Contra Memorial Trust Award winner for his work with this golf tournament. Great golf tournament put on at Granite Springs Golf and Country Club. We're going to be there. We're putting in a team. Tema is putting in a team. It's going to be myself, Kevin Davison, and NDP MLA David Wilson, who's also a former paramedic and huge mental health advocate. Now you may be thinking to yourself, you're one short of a foursome. And you're right. So here's what we're going to do. You want to be on our team? You can be. Email me at tematalks@tema.ca. And here's what I want you to do. Take a screenshot. Show me that you either follow our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, or on Instagram. Show me that. Then I want you to tell me what you do to look after your mental wellness. And then I want you to tell me what your favorite episode of either Up Talk or Tema Talks has been so far, and why. Tell me that, and if we have more than one person that tells me that, which I hope, we'll do a draw, and that person can be our fourth member of the team at no cost to them. Come out and play some golf with us and enjoy a great event. All right? That sounds good. So, it's not going to be long. You're going to hear from me again on Monday with another great guest, another awesome episode that I hope you enjoy. Please keep sharing the podcast, leave comments, subscribe, leave feedback, especially on Apple Podcasts or Google Play Music. Leave a rating. Give us a rating. For some reason, that's a big deal. So please do that. Thank you to everyone who continues to do that. You'll hear from me on Monday. Take care of yourself and each other, like always. More love, less judgment.
'Cause we ain't superheroes, we're just ordinary people trying to make the difference and the first on every scene. And it's a heavy, heavy burden to carry all this hurting when you can't unsee the things you've seen. It keeps going on. When those sirens are gone, it keeps going on. When those sirens are gone.